Hi, I'm Nina Gilden Seavey of My Fugitive, and I'm this week's guest on MetaPod.
You're listening to MetaPod, where we unpack the web's most interesting podcasts and the stories behind them, hosted by Wendy Morrill and Kevin May.
Hello, I'm Wendy Morrill.
And greetings, I'm Kevin May. We're back.
Was it really 2 weeks between episodes, Kev?
I think it was. Now, time generally has been a little off base these past 16 months or so, as we all know. So perhaps it was actually a month since our last show.
Well, either way, here we are, episode 22 of MetaPod. And actually, sense of time is a good segue to our guest this week.
That's right. We're going back initially to May 1970. When an undergraduate student by the name of Howard Mechanic was arrested and charged under the Civil Obedience Act after events surrounding a Vietnam War protest in Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri, in the US.
He was sentenced to 5 years in jail, despite the best efforts of his attorney, a civil rights lawyer named Louis Gilden. But then Howard Mechanic disappeared, assumed the new name of Gary Treadway, and created a new life for himself in Scottsdale, Arizona.
That's right. So Treadway, Mechanic, essentially stayed on the run for the next 28 years before eventually handing himself into the authorities in 2000. He was sent back to jail, but actually pardoned by none other than President Bill Clinton on the eve of his leaving office.
Okay, so that's an intriguing story in and of itself, but there's a lot more to the My Fugitive podcast, including how the St. Louis area had many connections to the assassin of Martin Luther King Jr., James Earl Ray.
Yeah, so throw in the behaviour of the FBI at the time, under the leadership of J. Edgar Hoover, with its surveillance of and underhand attempts at manipulation of the civil rights and anti-war movements, and things get pretty messy.
My Fugitive, which is produced and hosted by documentary filmmaker Nina Gilden Seavey, has two distinct threads that, when woven together, create a much bigger picture of the time period. There's the story of Howard Mechanic, and then there's the story of the U.S. government's actions against civil rights and war protesters in the late 60s and early 70s.
So, in our terrific conversation with Nina, you may have actually noticed that part of her surname is the same as that of Mechanic's lawyer, as yes, she is Louis Gilden's daughter. So, we discuss Mechanic, and then we get into all sorts of issues ranging from trust in institutions and the freedom of information to state surveillance and, well, a lot more.
It's a big episode about big things, you might say. It's also very good. So we'll be back after the chat with Nina about the podcast.
So no pun intended given the subject matter, but please let's start the tape, dare I say.
Nina Gilden Seavey, welcome to MetaPod. We're glad you could join us this week.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Kev and I have been talking a lot about My Fugitive, the podcast, so we're glad you're here.
And I'm glad to be here. I mean, I think it's amazing that you all sort of have heard about the podcast from our various places on the planet. So it's exciting to me to be able to reach out to your audiences.
So there'll be MetaPod listeners that have already listened to My Fugitive and some that have not. Mm-hmm. And a question that I hope has an answer that will satisfy both of these groups. What would you say is the most salient emotion that people finish this podcast with, and why?
So I think you have to walk away from the podcast feeling some both pensiveness as well as hope. I think that the questions that the podcast get to, some of which obviously are very personal to me, which I was a little bit surprised that I shared, but also that there is a process by which people are held to account. It's not necessarily a fast process, but it is a process by which, if you are diligent and determined, that we find out things about the human experience, about the political environment in which we exist in, the progress does occur. And I think that what you find out in the podcast is that we are now finding out a lot, or I found out a lot about a large swath of history that sort of was, kind of my story sort of focuses very intensely on, kind of St. Louis and the national scene between 1967 and 1972. But that becomes a metaphor for something much larger, which is why I call it timeless. I mean, it's not an anachronism. It's not a relic of history. It's not antiquarianism. It is, in fact, the world in which we currently live. So there are things that we don't know, but I do believe that we have a good amount of insight into the questions that need to be asked.
To follow on that, would you like listeners to act on the emotions that they have after listening to My Fugitive?
Well, I mean, I'm not so sure. I mean, I think some of them are intellectual questions. How much do we question our national leaders about issues of national security, certainly here in the United States in the wake of the Patriot Act? I mean, how do we approach sort of that push me, pull you between national security and civil liberties, which is always a very dynamic process, and who is held to account and who is making these decisions for us, and how transparent is that process? So, the question, and then there's the very personal, story, the very personal narrative that I tell about the issue of subversion and government surveillance on my family. And so that is all interwoven into this much larger political and historical narrative that has to do with Howard Mechanic and Dr. Martin Luther King and the assassination investigation into his death.
So the story starts actually 51 years ago on this very day, May 5th.
Right, sort of between May 4th and May 5th, sort of right around midnight. Yes.
Okay. And it starts in St. Louis, Missouri, and it's pretty clear that your father plays a big role in the story and your life and the work that you've done on this story. I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit about your father, and my question is if there were ever periods where you doubted your father's work.
Well, I have to say, my father was a well-known civil rights attorney in the state of Missouri, which didn't have many civil rights attorneys. Both the states, the states of the American South, and certainly of the border states, being a civil rights attorney, they were few and far between, and their lives were very difficult. And both the government and the courts made it as difficult as possible for these individuals to practice, both in terms of subversion, surveillance. Judges, he would bring a case to court, and even if the appellant won the case, frequently the judge said, they will rule in favor of the plaintiff, but Gilden gets no money. So that it was possible, that he could spend years and years in court and never receive a dime in compensation. So, he lived, kind of this very strife-ridden existence that was very political, that made our family very political. And I talk in the first episode about the bomb dogs that would come at dawn and sniff underneath my father's car. And it was my job to sort of hold the family terrier happy to make sure that he didn't attack the bomb dogs. That was the way I grew up. I didn't know anything else, but it takes a toll. It takes a toll on a family. I describe a scene, I believe it's in episode 3, where my mother, where we have an FBI agent in the house who at that point is protecting us from people who have threatened to kidnap my brothers and me and assassinate my father. And my mother is sitting on the couch crying. And this is a very, very early memory for me. It was sort of emblematic of the difficulty, the real personal struggle that my parents had and that we had as a family. And then I sort of go on to say, after my parents divorced and then he lived in a different house. And so, that gives the audience some sense that, things, were not all, Rosie in Rockville. So, but it was a difficult life. I don't think I ever didn't believe in that cause, but it's hard to live your principles that intensely. But, if you look at, other members of the civil rights movement, other members of the student movement, other people, who stick to their conscience. I mean, we see it right now, going on in in Congress right now, where Liz Cheney is about to lose her seat for sticking to her conscience. And she's going to lose her power in the U.S. House of Representatives. And, people of conscience frequently make very, very difficult trade-offs.
I'm interested if we can dwell a little bit longer on your childhood for a moment. There is a phrase, maybe it's universal, certainly one that we have here in the UK, which is bringing your work home with you. Now, you talk about, the FBI would come for some protection and you knew about threats, but did you understand perhaps the minutiae of some of the work that he was involved in, or was it just the kind of the stuff on the periphery?
Well, I think it's interesting. I didn't really understand what he did. I didn't understand. I mean, first of all, why would I was 6. Why is somebody, threatening to kill us? You don't know anything different, right? So as I got older and started to understand a little bit more about what he did and sort of the cases that he was taking on, that really nobody else was going to take those cases. I mean, there were maybe 3 or 4 attorneys in the state of Missouri who would take on these kinds of cases. Most people didn't want to represent Black clients. Most people didn't want to, fight for fair housing. Most people didn't want to, have anything to do with the difficulties of the student movement and burning draft cards and all of the kind of and the protest movement and getting these students out of jail. Because to be quite frank, there was no money in that. There was very little way to support a family. I mean, my father did a lot of, kind of very typical lawyering work, but the lion's share of his clients were very, very complicated cases that went on for a very long time. It was only in hindsight that I came to understand how particular it was. And I described that scene at the Supreme Court, where my father is literally yelling at the Chief Justice Berger. And that just seemed like my dad, but most people don't yell at the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, but he did. And he won that case 9-0. His arguments were always compelling. His arguments were always ones of conscience. I think the other thing is that, I think there's a little told story, of the white families that really sacrificed a lot for the civil rights movement. And you hear a little bit about that, in the story about Stanley Levison. Frequently these were Jewish attorneys who, kind of had experienced a lot of discrimination themselves, who got involved in the civil rights movement. And I think that there is this sort of untold story of kind of who these individuals were and what did they sacrifice, as so many others did, who were at the lunch counters and, in Selma and all, and jailed. And there was a whole cadre of white attorneys in general who supported them, people who came out and protested with them. There's sort of there's an unheralded story about people who really sacrificed, and it was frightening because the people who would call our home, and there was one story that didn't make it into the cut of the show, but my brother and I were walking home from school one day, and we had a housekeeper because my mother worked, which was very unusual at the time. So there's a housekeeper, and she comes flying down the stairs, and she says, "Don't go in the house. They're going to blow up the house. They just called and they said they know that I'm in there by myself and they're going to blow up the house." And my brother and I just looked at each other, and she fled. She was gone. She never to return. And we just walked in the house and said, that's just the way it is. We came to understand that there was risk and there was sacrifice. And that was the way that, a lot of both African American and white families lived their lives in order to live, kind of that question of conscience.
We'll come back to your kind of experience of pulling the podcast together and your investigation based on what you just said. But before we do, the three main characters arguably in the story. So one is Howard Mechanic.
Right.
Sorry, four. Howard Mechanic, your father, J. Edgar Hoover, and James Earl Ray.
Right.
When did you become aware of Howard Mechanic? Because I'm guessing your father you knew very well. J. Edgar Hoover is a very famous figure in American politics. And the assassin, James Earl Ray, is obviously well known. But when did you become aware of Howard Mechanic?
Well, as I say, kind of in the podcast, you get this sort of hint that, I'm about 12 years old at the time of the burning of the ROTC building. And Howard, Howard was just another one of my father's clients. I mean, he wasn't notable. I mean, my father had this bevy of students and, nobody ever paid anybody. And, he never, so it was, but these students had to be represented and they were burning their draft cards and they were, getting arrested at protests. And certainly the night of May 4th, 1970, which was the night of the Kent State murders, of course, ROTC building at Washington University went up in flames. Then there, he had almost no end of clients. So they sort of divvied up all of the different clients. And my father got both Howard Mechanic and Larry Cogan, who then became charged by the U.S. attorney under what was known as the 1968 Civil Rights Act, the H. Rap Brown provision, which made it so a federal crime to impede the progress of a police officer or firefighter in the conduct of their duty during a protest. So if you got in their way while they're trying to put out a fire or get control of the crowd, that was then a federal crime. Well, Howard and Larry were the only two individuals that were ever charged under that provision prior to 1970. And the only ones charged ever since until the Trump inauguration. They used it during the Trump inauguration, that provision, to bring charges against some of those protesters in 2016. So you think about it, from 1968 until 2016, the only two people who have been brought up on charges under that provision are Howard Mechanic and Larry Cogan. The other students were brought up under sabotage charges.
The reason why I ask is, when did you become aware of, or more aware of, what the Howard Mechanic story was? Was it once he returned after he'd been exposed by the newspaper reporter in Phoenix, or was it before then? I know you said
much longer.
It was something that had always played on your father's mind, that his clients who'd absconded, as we say.
So it really, in that sense, so as I was saying, so here you had these two students who were being made an example of. So that was kind of unusual, but I'm not so sure I was all that cognizant of it. But when my father lost their case, which he was very surprised about, because there literally was no evidence against them. And then there was this guy, Donald Byrd, whose story just kept changing and changing. And of the 19 prosecution witnesses, there was just him who actually testified that he had seen Howard do it, and Larry as well. And that, meaning throw a cherry bomb at a policeman. But nobody thought that they could be convicted, for such a minimal crime where nobody was hurt. And then also that there was really no evidence. So no one thought that they would be convicted. So when, my father ended up having to take that case, he appealed all the way to the Supreme Court and they refused to hear the case. So when Howard fled, which was in the fall of 72, so they had been in court for all that time, and he had gone to jail for a short period of time on a lesser local charge. Both he and Larry had gone to jail, which was the moment at which he realized he couldn't do 5 years. So when he fled, my father had never represented somebody who had been a fugitive. He had never had somebody not show up for their incarceration. And they really, and Judge Meredith really threw the book at Howard. He got 5 years in federal penitentiary and a $10,000 fine. Larry got a provisional 5 years in prison, but was sentenced to a mental institution. He served 6 months and was then released. But when Howard fled, he started to take on this almost mythological proportion in our family about, where did he go and how did, what happened to him, and like, was he ever going to come back? And of course, the government assumed that my father knew where he was and came after him for it.
So, I mean, the student protest movement of the late 60s and 70s is obviously the context of Howard Mechanic's activities and the target of government suppression at the time. Is this story appealing to today's youth? I hate using the phrase today's youth, but do young people today find this an appealing story or something to learn from?
Well, listen, from a variety of perspectives. First of all, if you're a minority youth, you're definitely interested in this. The reason being is that if you're a part of a Muslim community, if you're part of an African-American community, if you're part of a Native American community, this issue of surveillance is still very present. This issue of government infiltration. There was a wonderful film that was done a number of years ago about a Muslim community. The film was called The Feeling of Being Watched. And again, in the wake of the Patriot Act, we've had so much of this issue of government suppression and government infiltration and neutralization of political organizations. I think in the wake of the Trump era, this is a very, very present question. And I think one of the issues that the podcast raises and is sort of kind of part of my quest is the issue of who really was involved in the assassination of King, which of course gets tied into when I start to dig very, very deep into kind of the entire kind of textile, the fabric of what happens with Howard Mechanic. And the idea that we celebrate the birthday every January of a civil rights icon, and we have no clue as to what actually happened in his assassination. That's mind-boggling to me.
Yeah. Given who your father was, given that Howard Mechanic and his disappearance for almost 30 years, what you were uncovering during the process of your investigations, did you ever feel like you were being watched?
Well, I think at the time, and I go into this just a little bit in the podcast, when I find Howard while he's still underground. So I kind of grow up in this mythology of Howard Mechanic. And I become a filmmaker, a documentary filmmaker. It's what I do is I tell stories. I tell my father, I'm going to find Howard Mechanic. And we have that sort of argument that I talk about. And he says, no, you're not going to do this. And I think, he just doesn't want me meddling in his affairs, whatever. But it wasn't that, because I did get that call from the U.S. Marshals, and they knew that I'd been in touch with Howard. Now, you start to make inquiries, you start to ask around, you don't know who really you're asking, you don't know how that information gets out, but how that came to sort of splash back on me. And at the time I had 3 young children. I mean, I was a young mother and, concerned for the safety of my children. And to be quite frank, did not want my children to go through what I had gone through. Protecting my family from sort of government infiltration, government kind of surveillance became incredibly important to me. And so I always wanted to protect my children and my husband from the kind of compromises that were made in my house. And so when it became clear that the marshals were watching what I was doing, I backed off at that point. And then not too long, within a year or so, Howard came up. Well, he didn't come up voluntarily. He did something amazingly interesting and was found.
It's interesting you say that when you realized that they were kind of onto you, for want of a better phrase, and then you gave up. Mm-hmm. I'm going to say this respectfully. Did that not feel like you were giving up and giving in to the pressure that you were perceived, that you thought you might be under from the authorities?
No, it's interesting. I mean, I think it could be interpreted that way, and no disrespect. I don't take any disrespect at all. I think it's a good sort of question. It's kind of a moral quandary that I had with myself, which was that we had made choices in my father had made choices for our family that I was not willing to make. In terms of compromise, in terms of the stress that it puts on a family. And it wasn't the first time that I sort of had this kind of question of my own priorities. Like, what do I want? How do I want to construct my life as distinct from the way that it was constructed for me as a child? I had been asked by the local Democratic Party to run for office in the hopes with the anticipation that I would ultimately run for Congress from this area. And I had worked in Congress. I worked for Congresswoman Pat Schroeder from Colorado back in the day. And it was just a compromise I was not willing to make. I wasn't willing to compromise my family for politics in any way, shape, or form, whether it was infiltration or public service in that very, very intense sort of way that running for Congress requires of you.
So you spent 10 years or so researching and investigating for this story that's presented in the podcast. You requested countless documents from U.S. government agencies that led to a lawsuit, from what I understand. I guess my question is simple. Do these mechanisms work?
It's so funny you should ask that. Before we were talking, I was on Twitter, and Jason Leopold, who does a lot of BuzzFeed, kind of FOIA, revelations, all kinds. He's sort of, he's talked about the fact that he has had to sue the FBI 30 times. And Jason Leopold, he and I have the same attorney, and a guy named Jeff Light, who is just a brilliant FOIA attorney. And no, it's so broken. It's so broken. The FOIA system is broken. The fact that the very posture of the government is to do everything in its conceivable power to stand in your way. Okay, that's, well, it feels, like a Jean Anouilh play. It just feels kind of crazy. It doesn't deal with the fact that as a society, we need to be able to report the truth. So these government institutions, and specifically FOIA, and look, this wasn't just Trump. Obama was no hero on this score either. So, the FOIA morass, as I would call it, has gotten much more profound. But I did something that was somewhat anathema to them, which is I filed 357 different requests in what's known as a behemoth. So I didn't really know what I was looking for. I just knew names, dates, all kinds of information. And I sued for that information. And I sued not just the FBI, but the FBI, the CIA, the National Archives, and then under a separate action, the Department of the Army. So this large assault that I sort of brought, I sort of drove my dump truck up to the government and, kind of backed it, sort of just dump my load there. They were going to fight back. And sure enough, they had a plan. Ultimately, we all agreed that there was 150,000 sort of relevant documents that were due to me.
150,000?
150,000. They said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to give you 500 a month, which is our standard. And so my attorney, dear Jeff Light, sort of says, well, okay, let's do the math on this. Mm-hmm. So I was going to be like 192 or something like that when I finally got my last release. So we sued for them to release that material to me in the course of 3 years, which is what they did. And I went through every single page, one by one, by one, 150,000 times.
If you go to the Freedom of Information Act webpage, I mean, I've written it down here, it provides the public, quote, the right to request access to records from any federal agency. Mm-hmm. It is often described as the law that keeps citizens in the know about their government. I mean, my personal comment is it would be great if it were that simple, but it takes people like you who are willing to request everything that potentially could matter and then connect the dots. Can regular people do?
I think regular people live at the, kind of at the behest of the government in this case. I think, it takes such a tremendous fortitude. And in my case, I was very fortunate that, I had an attorney who was so adept at the machinations. But I think it literally, I don't think it's intended for the average citizen, right? It's like, I mean, and look, some agencies are easier to FOIA than others. The National Park Service might be easier to FOIA than the FBI. I mean, I don't know that to be true, but
sure.
Somewhere out there, there's just things that are easier. The FBI is notoriously difficult, although I will tell you the biggest problem that I had was not with the FBI, but with the National Archives for a very odd reason. So, and because, I love the National Archives. I've been doing work in the National Archives for, the entirety of my career, but they are so woefully understaffed that they have a 4-year wait just for them to entertain your request. So that's tantamount to, not giving it to you at all. So when we sued them, and we sat down across the table, and I love archivists. They are the nicest, most wonderful people on this planet. And they looked at me and they were so sad that I was doing this to them. And so the chief archivist, she said, we're doing the best we can. And I'm like, I understand that. And I love you. And everybody needs to sue you because that's when you're going to go to Congress and say, we need help. Mm-hmm. And so, because a 4-year wait just to have and look, once they entertain your request, that can be another year or two. The system is literally broken.
Let me ask you this if we can, Nina, and
Sure.
Apologies if this comes across as someone who's naive and not from the US.
Sure.
What are they trying to hide? Because I'm assuming the majority of the protagonists around this particular case, Harold Mechanic and Martin Luther King, are probably dead.
Yeah.
And perhaps it would be fair to say that the reputation of some of the institutions, such as the FBI, is fairly tarnished already.
Right.
So what are they trying to either stall or hide or just take so long that you give up and go and make a different documentary?
Right. You just go away. I think it's a question of, some of it is a question of bureaucracy. Somebody like me comes along, to be honest, and really makes a problem. Somebody asks you for 150,000 of anything, you're a problem, right? But if they hadn't been so difficult, I probably wouldn't have been so difficult myself. So, we didn't start out with that posture, right? We started out kind of reasonable. Well, give us this, and this, and we'll be fine. We'll go away. I think what's happened is that the institutions have become calcified. It's not that they're afraid of any one secret getting out. If you take a position of no, mm-hmm. then no secret can get out. So it literally is just, if all answers are no, then you risk nothing. The institution risks nothing, the government risks nothing, and everybody is just sort of stuck in their respective foxholes. And to be quite frank, most people will just go away.
Yeah.
Most people, life's just too short to spend it, except for Jason Leopold, who seems to have now done it 30 times, that it's very, very hard. And it's very wearing, grinds down your soul to do something like this.
Yeah.
But, but I think I think the answer to your question is they do it so that they are never compromised. They don't reveal any truth. So even a good truth might emerge, right? That's always a possibility. But I think if you say no to everything, it's just easier because then nothing crawls out from underneath the rock.
Does no across the board actually benefit anyone on the outside of the agencies?
I don't think that that's their concern. I mean, that their concern is not transparency to the public. They will do what the law requires them to do, what the Congress requires them to do, what the Constitution requires them to do. But the extent to which a documentarian or a journalist wants to shed light on a certain issue, well, that's kind of their cross to bear. That's not that question of the transparency and the truthfulness of any institution is, hopefully it's a priority, but it's not their mission.
I wonder if you said, towards the end of the podcast, you want to get to the truth as to who or what number of people were behind the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr.
Mm-hmm.
If you came up with something that was very concrete, more names. We talk about the different operations that were uncovered in the files that were released and things like that, Operation Solo and those kind of initiatives, if we can call them that.
Sure.
If you came up with the truth, do you think the American public, after listening to your podcast, would be, yeah, well, that wasn't a surprise, because their faith in the institutions, not least the FBI, is so eroded through series after series after series of different things that have been uncovered that they'd be like, well, it's terrible, but I'm not surprised.
Well, I think you've hit on a good point, which is that, essentially we become cynics. We become a society of cynics. And I think, it certainly goes back, to Watergate, where, this, and I remember that transition where, this notion in the belief in government, which really up until the time of Watergate had been, if the government said something that felt like truth to you, right? And so, the first real abrogation of that compact between the governed and the governed, those who are governed and those who are in government, was really breached, felt like during Watergate. And ever since then, and that's 72, 73, 74. And then in 75, we have the revelations that come out during the Church Committee, which I go obviously into in great depth in episode 7, and then the House Committee on Assassinations in episode 8. So the question isn't so much whether or not, people ultimately say, well, we're not surprised. The question is that we need to know the truth. And I think, one of the biggest, it's hard to kind of take me by surprise, but when I was interviewing Vice President Mondale and he's talking about this deposition that he took, that was really, an entire day with the architect of COINTELPRO, the person who ran the program, who literally, as Mondale says, wants to get everything off of his chest, right? So we know that thing it's golden. Yep. So, and then he looks at me and says, that's pretty amazing, don't you think? And I'm like, Vice President, I wouldn't know. It's still under seal. And so he's like, really? And I'm like, really? And so, here I am instructing the Vice President of the United States that the thing that he thinks is so central to our understanding of the rights of civil liberties and sort of the kind of this reckoning with the truth is literally still under seal. And look, I go into it in episode 8, but I'm worried that because of the Department of Justice, that in terms of the King assassination, much of that stuff doesn't even exist any longer. But I think that we make a very, very compelling case about what happened in St. Louis.
Yeah, just to give the opposite kind of point of view, there have been so many incidences, not just in the US, but in other countries as well, the UK notwithstanding as well, where conspiracies and nefarious activities by governments and their agencies happen a lot. But then it automatically sometimes means that people will believe the conspiracy before they believe the truth. And that, again, is a fundamental problem, isn't it? We always think someone is behaving badly rather than, what, Occam's razor, that's just the way it is.
And and again, I think it's because we've almost become inured to the bad acts. So you just say, oh, well, of course, right now we have a huge conspiracy, the big lie that former president of the United States is propagating as that the election was not legitimately won by the current president. And 70% of all Republicans believe that conspiracy. That's insane. That's almost the epitome of what it is that you're talking about. But the fact is you have to fight that. You have to fight that with the truth. You have to take a stand on those conspiracies. You have to be diligent in making sure that truth comes to overshadow conspiracy, that you don't get sucked into the kind of the nefarious dark side of the human spirit. I do think that, and I loved it when Robert Blakey, the chief counsel of the House Committee on Assassinations, says to me, don't get sucked into the conspiracy. And I stop. But because the case that we've made is significant enough.
Just a quick point that I'm curious about, actually. Would you say that now the media or certain elements of the media are more complicit in perpetuating conspiracies? And I'm thinking about, the way Fox News covers the election and things.
You mean like Rupert Murdoch and everything he's ever touched?
Yeah, well, you took the words out of my mouth. I was waiting for you to say it, but no. but you know what I mean? Perhaps in the turn of the 70s, and if you go back to the assassination of JFK and Bobby Kennedy as well, perhaps the media were slightly less kind of towing a particular line than perhaps they are now.
Well, I think that the notion, and again, this is like an entirely different conversation, but the notion of what is journalism has become so intermeshed with what is entertainment, and what drives an entertainment division are ratings. What drives it's eyeballs. It's kind of that never-ending search for, an increased audience. What drives a news division and what drives, the suits and the big offices upstairs crazy is the search for truth. Currently, what is being peddled in, these various, kind of iterations of Rupert Murdoch land, that it's entertainment. It's not intended to get to the truth. It's intended to kind of feed itself into a kind of a never-ending juggernaut of more and more viewership. But so the goals of those two things are entirely different. Sure, NBC cares about the news ratings, but they really, really, really care about the truth. Cable is a bit more, is a complicated story. And look, it's not just the Rupert Murdoch. I mean, you can, it's not just Fox News and some of these other newer outlets. I mean, the question of sort of MSNBC and CNN and some of their reporting is also makes this very bifurcated.
Nina, what has some of the most difficult feedback been that you've received about the podcast?
To be honest, and this is so interesting to me because podcasting and filmmaking is so different in this way. I make a film, it gets reviewed everywhere, right? A studio makes a film or a distributor makes a film, they get behind it and it just gets reviewed, and you get good reviews and you get bad reviews. Podcasting is so much more the Wild West, which is what, it's like the two of you deciding to make a podcast. And there's a lot of people out there with very sort of, organic grassroots material that's just being generated all the time. So to be honest, we haven't gotten any bad reviews. People have really enjoyed the story. They think the story is solid. I think they like my rendition of the story. I think so far, at least, up until now, maybe this will launch a tidal wave of criticism, which I don't want.
Sorry, or you're welcome. I don't know.
No. I say, bring it on. I'm fair game for anything. But podcast listenership is very driven in so many ways by listeners who listen to other podcasts. So, it's just, people are finding great stories. They're finding, the kind of these newer voices. I mean, in that sense, I'm a longtime storyteller, but this is the first time I've told a story in this format. But the notion of the role of the curator, meaning like critics and newspapers and people who print reviews, it's much less salient in this format than it is in filmmaking.
Last one from me, if I can, Nina.
Mm-hmm.
Scale of 1 to 10. The reputation of the FBI in your mind in the turn of the 70s is, say, 0. What would you say the reputation of the FBI is now on that scale of 1 to 10? Has it repaired its reputation to some degree or not, do you think?
I think it's gone through periods under William Webster, who was, by the way, just fun factoid, one of the he was the judge in the Joe Eisenberg conviction from the night of May 4th, 1970. So he actually was in St. Louis and ruled in one of those cases, and ruled against Joe Eisenberg, who you hear in episode 6. And William Webster was the judge in that case, but he also then later on became the head of the FBI and the CIA. And I think there was a period of time where it sort of kind of made its reputation, it kind of burnished its reputation. I think we are going to start seeing now, and this is very, very much a topic of today's news, that under Bill Barr, things went very badly again, both in the Department of Justice and in the FBI. And so, I don't even want to put a number on it because I would say that that's a TBD. That during the Trump administration, we saw these agencies revert back to the way that they had been manipulated by Richard Nixon, by J. Edgar Hoover, by John Mitchell, in many, many, many of the same ways. And so I wouldn't put, a rating on it, but I think, under Janet Reno, under, you've had a kind of under Mueller, you've had a long list of people who have been at the Department of Justice and at the head of the FBI who, I didn't necessarily agree with their politics, but, I think they attempted to mete out justice fairly. I think we are seeing a reversion right now, and it is just starting to trickle out. That's 4 years of a subversion of both the Department of Justice and potentially of the FBI. And I think there's going to be a lot more to know about that.
Do you know if Howard Mechanic has listened to the podcast?
He has. I'm still in very, close contact with Howard. After he came up, and of course he spoke in 2001 after he was released from prison. And received his presidential pardon. Really his first, public appearance was at my father's memorial service. And you get a bit of that in the podcast. But I've continued to work with Howard. And look, I interviewed him, I think it may have been in 2015. And look, this was initially a film. This project was initially, kind of what I did for a living, a documentary film. And the moment at which I touched that third rail, which, kind of the electrified rail of how this all became intertwined with the assassination investigation of Dr. Martin Luther King, I knew this was so much bigger than a 90-minute film could accommodate. And I changed formats.
Okay.
So he really likes it. Yesterday, this week, and I don't know when your podcast will come out, but we just released episode 7, which episode 6, which is his life on the run. Mm-hmm. And so it is, I think people will be interested in what's it like to live as a fugitive. You don't get a window into that very much. Mm-hmm. And of course, you get a bit into that in the character of James Earl Ray, who's a fugitive from justice at the time that he assassinates King, and then continues his fugitive existence after that. But I think people are interested in people who live altered lives. And I think Howard's story is kind of an object lesson in the compromises that get made for that life.
What's next for My Fugitive?
There was a Dateline NBC, I think we talk a little bit about that, piece a long time ago about Howard. He was still in prison at the time. I think that, we have a number of both episodic and, nonfiction episodic opportunities in front of us, some book opportunities that allows us to tell this very, very sort of kind of holistic story, and then some narrative, some feature narrative films opportunities that are kind of coming down the pike. So, it takes a long time to get a podcast out, as you know, and so I think we're sort of. We haven't released all 8 episodes. Obviously, you can binge on the Odyssey app, but most people we're finding are still listening to it on Apple, Spotify, Google Play. The places that you get your traditional podcasts. Mm-hmm. And so we're just about to release episode 7 next week, and then episode 8 after that, and then we'll really start the next phase of this storytelling.
Okay. Nina Gilden Seavey, thank you so much for joining us here on MetaPod.
And thank you so much, Wendy and Kevin. Thank you so much for having me. It's been fun to talk about these things. I think about this material a lot, and I think about these questions, and it's really a joy to talk with people about sort of these are very, very complicated ethical, moral, philosophical questions of how society functions. Yeah. It's interesting to talk about them and think about them inside of my little, sort of my little recording booth, but it's really wonderful to be able to talk them out with a live audience.
And you also got to give a shout out to all the world's archivists as well.
And look, they are the best people in the world. The American Society of Archivists should, nominate me for their prize of the year, because we love. I cannot say enough wonderful things about the archivists.
Thank you very much, Nina.
Thank you. You have a great day now.
Thank you. We hope listeners will forgive us for the long episode this week, but frankly, we don't care, and we hope you don't either. It was an enthralling discussion, and we hope you'll go and listen to My Fugitive if you haven't already. Nina's done a lot of research, and we could have talked to her for a lot longer.
Indeed, we could. So our huge thanks to Nina Gilden Seavey for her time when we talked to her a few weeks ago. I actually learned quite a lot about that period in US history from listening to My Fugitive. So to actually get into some meaty discussions with her about the issues surrounding both Mechanic's disappearance and the role of the FBI in a bunch of things was fascinating, if actually a little unsettling.
I agree. So listeners, we should update you since our schedule has changed a bit, and we haven't just kicked back to laze around for the summer, have we, Mr. May?
Oh, no, we have not. In fact, just last week, we recorded what will be the first of a number of special episodes of MetaPod.
Alongside our regular chats with the hosts of the web's most interesting podcasts, we'll be talking to some of the pioneers of the podcasting world. Recently, we've tracked down a fellow named Todd Cochran. In addition to being one of the first podcasters, Todd wrote the first book on podcasting in 2005.
Yep. Todd's been there, done that, is actually still doing it right from the very beginning, and has some fascinating stories to tell about that early period, as well as lots of views on how the podcast world has evolved ever since.
We haven't quite decided when to add these special episodes into the MetaPod mix, but we wanted to let you know that they're coming. So if you have suggestions for special episodes of MetaPod, please let us know. We're easy to contact via metapodshow.com, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Coming back to our regular programming in 2 weeks, we have Eric Mennel, host of the podcast called Stay Away from Matthew McGill.
Yeah, we certainly do. Now, Wendy, how would you describe this particular podcast we've got coming up next?
Let's see. A very handsome and intriguing man dies alone and leaves behind a box of secrets. These secrets lead to other secrets, and it's all unraveled through a very unusual mix of investigation and personal memoir.
All right. So, okay, like My Fugitive, Stay Away from Matthew McGill is another excellent podcast from the Pineapple Street Studio stable of shows. We'll put a link to them in the show notes for this particular episode today.
All right. Thanks for listening to another episode of MetaPod. And thanks again to Nina Gilden Seavey. We'll see you all next time. That's in 2 weeks.
That's it for MetaPod this time. Thanks for listening. MetaPod will be back soon with another unpacking of the web's most interesting podcasts. But in the meantime, make sure to subscribe at any of the usual places you find your other favourite podcasts. We'd hate for you to miss upcoming episodes, and we'd love it if you left us a review. You can let us know what you think of this episode by going to metapodshow.com. We'll see you next time. MetaPod is produced by Wendy Morrill and Kevin May,